Hello again, friends. I did a previous tier list video where I showed the top 4 decks and explained where I thought they each were with respect to each other. This is going to be a continuation of that, covering tier 2 decks and tier 2.5 decks. The tier 2 decks I'm evaluating as, if you go first, there's a very good chance that you can beat a tier 1 deck with it. And for tier 2.5, I'd say if you go first, it's about a 50-50 shot. And I'm using that because going first is tier SS++ in Vintage. So because that's the case, going first just makes it so that you can win games even against decks that you shouldn't beat. One of the decks in tier 2, I've actually beaten set 12 Revengers with only because I went first, and I beat them 6-0. So let's go ahead and start covering them, starting with Stern Blaukluger. If you wanted a top 5 instead of a top 4, Stern Blaukluger would obviously be the 5th best deck. I don't think it's as good to be in tier 1, but it is still very strong. Its effect is basically when this unit's attack hits a Vanguard, you win the game. And, I mean, that's pretty good. With 12 critical triggers, Nova Grapplers get to have a fairly optimized trigger lineup, and you need Counterblast, so you have to take damage early. So this deck wants those heal triggers, so your trigger lineup is already given for you. You have Rocket Hammerman to give you a 21k Stern Blaukluger before the restand if you have a Tough Boy boost. You have a 12k attacker that can also make 18k with weak 6k rear guards, which you're going to have a lot of. You have the ability to basically demolish any rush decks, because anything that's going to overcommit to the board early is going to have an excessive amount of difficulty dealing with the on-hit Vanguard that they're going to have to guard every turn for the rest of the game or they die. So Stern Blaukluger ends up being in a very, very solid spot and is easily the 5th best deck. Much stronger than Phantom Blaster Overlord, not even a contest. The next deck in tier 2 I have is Cat Butler Grade 2 Rush. If you are playing Deer Days 2 against the AI, don't play this deck. Rush decks require your opponent to not hit defensive triggers, and the computer is a cheating bastard. So because that's the case, I don't recommend if you're trying to play this again against the AI, but if you're playing online, this deck is very, very strong. You get to flood the board early with a bunch of powerful units. You actually have a Forerunner with Battle Riser that you can pull back. If you get high-powered Riser Custom as your Vanguard, that's a 16k attacker that gets to restand with Cat Butlers plus any triggers. Hitting a single trigger makes it 21k. That's very lethal. You have backup options with Brutal Jack, which is also an 11k rear guard. And as Vanguard, it's 11k, but can, with a boost, swing for 16k. And then you also have Cup Bowler as a potential backup ride as well. Cup Bowler, every single time one of your rear guards becomes rested, he gets 1000 power, and that includes during the battle phase. You can actually do a main phase rest of Rocket Hammerman to give him plus 3k. And then with 4 more rear guards being rested, he becomes 16k without a boost. So you have plenty of outs to give yourself insanely powerful Vanguard rows. And because you're rushing and hand dumping everything you have to the board, you also are able to push your opponent very early with damage. The only thing that's really going to stop you is if they hit a bunch of early damage triggers, and as I explained before, the AI will do that against you, so not recommended for normal farming for VP. Otherwise, this deck is great online. Next, we're going to talk about the set 4 ride chain decks other than Stern. So obviously, Kagero doesn't have the right tools to want to use a set 4 ride chain as your grade 3 ride. And Amber Dragon Eclipse is garbage. But the other two, even though you do not use their effects, and they do the exact same thing as Amber Dragon Eclipse, they end up being optimal because of either their names, Phantom Blaster Dragon, or just because the deck really doesn't have, or the clan doesn't have a whole lot of other options with Giraffa. However, the hilarious thing between these two decks is that they are actually almost identical. So Giraffa typically runs Violent Vesper, a 9k grade 3, as its backup, and that is reveal the top card of your deck if it's a Mega Colony Superior, call it. Phantom Blaster Dragon runs Bobbed Car. It is 9k. Reveal the top card of your deck if it's a Shadow Paladin Superior, call it. Wow. They both are running, obviously, the ride chain, so the grade 2 at 2 or 3 copies. The grade 2 at 2 or 3 copies. They have the 12k attacker. This one has 2 different 12k attackers, and if you were worried about riding Bobbed Car, you could choose to run Masquerade instead. Either way, that's not going to have a substantive difference between the two decks. And then both of them have Counterblast 2 on hit, draw a card. This has Water Gang. This has Vaha. And with that, you could actually make these decks identical from grade 2 and above and identical from grade 0. That's pretty hilarious. Shadow Paladins do have other options. They can run Nimon to counterblast 1, pitch a card, draw 2. I don't recommend Nimon. I don't think it's as good as Maka. Maka is counterblast 2, choose a grade 1 from your deck, and superior call it. You can make Maka into a 16k row by calling a Karen from your deck, and I think that that is probably the ideal way to do that. Even though Maka's only 8k, she mitigates her own weakness, and that gives you a valid usage for those counterblasts, and it doesn't even have to hit, so that also gives you a 1-up on that front as well, since you, typically speaking, don't want to counterblast for Phantom Blast or Dragon's effect, in the same way that you don't want to counterblast for Giraffe's effect. For grade 1s, they're both running Perfect Guards, Vanillas, and the grade 1 Ride Chain, so because that's the case, you're now in a position where both of these decks are almost entirely identical. However, when it comes to grade 1 tech slots, Mega Colony has Mega Colony Battler B, which is when an attack hits that it boosts, counterblast 1, stun one of your opponent's units. That is such a good usage for counterblasts, and that gives Giraffe's grade 1 lineup the slight edge. But I would say Maka's probably a little bit stronger than Vaha and Water Gang, even though Water Gang and Vaha are both great. So maybe Shadow Paladins have a slight edge in the grade 2 game. But either way, these decks are so close, very similar, that they're basically the same thing, and I put them both in tier 2. I do think that it is suboptimal to run Phantom Blast or Overlord. If you're going to do it, then obviously you'd have to run Masquerade instead of the 12k instead of the what is it, Donnerschlag? Yeah, that's how much I pay attention to that card. So because you have Phantom Blast or Overlord as a potential backup ride, you wouldn't want to run it at 4 copies because you never want a Persona Blast, and it would only be a backup ride as an 11k or potentially 13k if you want to ride it over Phantom Blast or Dragon, just to get rid of excess grade 3s and potentially have a bit of extra defense. But the 13k defense is completely irrelevant for Shadow Paladin. There are decks that struggle to make 18k, but there's not that many decks because so many clans have so few options that they're forced to run the vanillas, and of the competitive decks, every single one of them has a 12k attacker. So because that's the case, the 12k plus a 6k boost is all that's required to hit 18k. You're not really looking at too many opportunities to have that 13k defense be relevant, the way that it is with Dragonic Overlord the End, which is killing all of the opponent's boosters, so therefore the 12k isn't hitting over the 13k, and they're going to run out of boosters unless they start calling triggers, which isn't going to make numbers with the 12k attacker. So Kagero has a complete advantage with cross-red defense that Shadow Paladin does not have. It does not exist for them. And because that's the case, I can't recommend Phantom Blast or Overlord being in tier 2. Moving on, we're going to talk about Pale Moon. There are 2 Pale Moon variants that I have in tier 2. Obviously, the Pale Moon engine is absolutely cracked at this stage of the game. Nightmare Doll Alice is an incredibly good card. And in addition to that, we also have the extra booster, which gives us access to Jumping Jill. And we have promos, which give us access to Purple Trapezist. Purple Trapezist makes Pale Moon so good, because at any point in time, if you've already attacked with your Vanguard, all you have to do is just shove the booster into Soul, and then you can call an extra card with Purple Trapezist and have that row be boosted, which gives Purple Trapezist so much versatility and mid-battle phase attacking that also allows you to bypass your opponent's defensive triggers in ways that are incredible. Even if your opponent is cross-ridden, if you use Purple Trapezist to move the booster or to move the front row attacker into Soul and then call out a Jumping Jill, that's an 18k row. So then they still have to drop 5k to guard that, or 10k if they haven't hit a defensive trigger. This gives Pale Moon such ridiculous outs to be able to just do incredible things in the battle phase. And that includes cards like Midnight Bunny and Mirror Demon, which both have similar effects to Alice, one when it boosts, one when it hits. And you can even swing a Mirror Demon row into a front row rear guard and have that counterblast both to bring out a much stronger row, such as potentially a Turquoise Beast Tamer with a Jumping Jill for 21k, which allows you to leverage your opponent losing 5,000 shield and you spinning 2 counterblasts to get out a 21k row, which is going to force out an additional 15k shield, which is insanely good. If your opponent is at 5 damage, Pale Moon is one of the scariest decks to be up against, and since we are forced into running 8 stand triggers anyway, that's already going to be incredible. When your opponent is at 5 damage, Pale Moon is objectively the best deck in Vintage. It's not even close. And in addition to that, we obviously have Crimson Beast Tamer to give bonus power to Turquoise Beast Tamer. She's also an 11k attacker that will stand for 16k. And that gives you a valid out for having a stand on your side row. And then you also have potential cards to fill up your soul like Nitro Juggler. Pale Moon actually has so many good grade 1s and 2s that you're actually at the point where you don't have to run vanillas in order to compensate for not having good options. And they're one of the few clans that's actually all the way there. Now, the question is, who is going to be the boss? And there are two really, really good bosses for Pale Moon right now. The first of them that I would recommend is Dusk Illusionist Robert. A lot of people are thinking, wait, Robert? Who runs Robert? And my only response to that is good people. People who want to win. Robert is Soul Charge 1, which allows you to feed that soul, potentially top charging something good. And his second part of that skill is CEO's skill. Look at the top card of your deck, put that card on the top or bottom of your deck. This gives you a 70% chance to hit triggers. If there is a trigger on the top of your deck, you know which one it is. If it's a stand trigger, you can prepare for that. If it's not a stand trigger, if it's a crit or a heal, you can also prepare for that by attacking Vanguard first if you need to. And in addition to that, if it's not a trigger, that still gives you that 70% chance to hit anyway. And being able to orchestrate your attacks around which triggers on top of your deck, if that happens to be what you see, that's incredibly good. That is just so very good. And the Mega Blast is obviously worthless. We don't care about that. But as far as it being a standalone boss, this is doing basically everything that you would need it to do without causing any real negative effects to you. The next boss that I would recommend would be Barking Manticore. Barking Manticore is a 13k attacker on your turn if you have Crimson Beast Tamer. I wish it worked on Rearguard, but it doesn't. But that being said, his on-ride effect is incredibly good. Draw a card, choose a card from hand, put it into Soul. This allows you to set up Crimson Beast Tamer if you missed it. This allows you to put a Purple Trapezist into Soul. This allows you to put a Jumping Jill into Soul. So this gives you the versatility to be able to set up your next combo play. And he also is going to hit reasonably good numbers, potentially up to 22k, which would even be relevant against MLB if you have a Turquoise behind him. And in addition to that, you can still do the same Pale Moon shenanigans, and he still has reasonable offensive pressure. Even more so than what Robert would have as a Vanguard, only Robert has the increased critical likelihood, so that's kind of a give and take. But his offensive pressure gets increased due to having that ability. If your opponent has a 10k Vanguard, then you even run the risk of your opponent having to overguard for you having a Midnight Bunny behind him, and then Midnight Bunny could be moved to Soul, and then if you already had a row that attacked, you could call over the booster with Purple Trapezist, move the card into Soul, move the card out of Soul, and then boom, you got a 18k row potentially, and that's really good. Even if I guess if your opponent's 10k, you could even just call a Mirror Demon and then have more on hit pressure, and it's 15k. If you hit a trigger, 20k. There's a lot that you can do with Pale Moon, and Pale Moon is in a super strong position. Obviously, it's got a little bit of a weakness to cross rides. It's got a bit of a weakness to specifically Kagero. But outside of Kagero, this deck is extraordinarily good. So moving on, I'm going to talk about the last deck for Tier 2, and that's going to be Riviere. I'm not 100% sold that Riviere belongs in Tier 2. However, if Riviere hits its ride chain, it's probably towards the top of Tier 2, about as good as Stern Blaukluger. Riviere's on-ride effect is pretty similar to Vortimer's, and it's just you get a card. And Vortimer's, you sacrifice a card, you get 2 cards, but this is you just draw a card. So you ride grade 2, draw a card, ride grade 3, draw a card. That's really, really strong. And because this doesn't have synergy with your other grade 3s that like to return to hand to let you draw cards, you get to run Saram with a Sedna boost for 21k as a side row. Now, having 21k as a side row is already hilarious, but Riviere's Persona Blast is Counterblast 2, Persona Blast. When this unit attacks, or when this unit's attack hits a Vanguard, you may pay the cost. If you do, choose up to 3 of your Bermuda Triangle rearguards, and they get 5,000 power until end of turn. So I heard that Soul Saver is a Tier 1 deck. This is on-hit Soul Saver Dragon. That's really, really strong. And also, this is going to put your opponent in a very precarious position, because they have to guard your Vanguard if they are at anything higher than 3 damage for the rest of the game. Because if you hit a critical trigger, which Bermuda Triangle actually has a pretty good amount of triggers, then that puts your opponent at 5, and then you now have, potentially, if you have that same Saram Sedna row, a 36,000 because of the trigger. A 36,000 row. Obviously, I'd put the trigger over on the other side, but a 31k row on one side. If your opponent doesn't have a PG for that, they're dead. And your opponent didn't have a PG, otherwise they would have used it on Riviere. So you could say that that's a little bit win more, but the pressure that this has is kind of similar to Stern, where if you hit and your opponent is in a precarious spot, they're going to die. And this is good at making them dead. The only weaknesses that Riviere has is that it doesn't have a whole lot of synergy with Bermuda Triangle's bounce mechanic, and that means that it's losing access to a lot of its advantage generation. And the other weakness is how far apart her eyeballs are. What the heck? But that is it for the Tier 2. Let's go ahead and move on to the Tier 2.5. So Pale Moon has another boss, and Pale Moon, as I said, was already in a super strong position. This boss is actually incredibly nutty with its continuous effect, which is during your turn, all of your Pale Moon rear guards get plus 3,000 power in the front row. Now, you remember Mirror Demon, right? That 8k card that was on hit. You remember that we have to run stand triggers, right? Okay. So think about this for a second. Mirror Demon is now 11k. You are forced to run 8 stand triggers. That is incredible. And now, let's just say hypothetically you're up against a cross ride. Your Alice is now 13k. And let's say that you're not up against a cross ride, you're up against a 10k. Your Alice with a Midnight Bunny is now 20k. You see where I'm going with this. Mirror Demon with a Turquoise Beast Tamer is now 20k. And Alice with a Turquoise Beast Tamer is now 22k, able to hit MLB. So that is obviously very good. And if that was all there was to Golden Beast Tamer would be Tier 1. But that's not all there is to Golden Beast Tamer. Soul Blast 3 to lose Restraint sucks. But the plus sides are so good that it's obviously a viable card. The problem is it's hard to fit Alice and Golden Beast Tamer in the same deck because you feel compelled to run a backup ride like Robert to fill your soul, so that way Golden Beast Tamer at least has an out to do something else, or you have the ability to at least bypass the restraint if you need to. And that creates a little bit of conflict with the deck. So that's why this one is Tier 2.5, just because that is really difficult for a deck to overcome, and that makes it a lot more complicated than it really needs to be. The plus sides are great, but the drawbacks are really, really bad. And it's because of that mesh that I think this is about a Tier 2.5 deck. So CEO has several decks that are Tier 2.5. The first one I'll cover is going to be CEO Meteor Break Dragon. Meteor Break Wizard is just another Ceram clone, another Boris clone. Counterblast 1 when it attacks, it gets plus 3k. So obviously it's just CEO with a 7k boost is 21k. Attack, you have 70% chance to pass triggers. OTT has 12 critical triggers. You're passing crits over to your Meteor Break Dragon. Why do I keep saying dragon? To your Meteor Break Wizard. And Meteor Break Wizard will get 21,000 power, 26k with a crit, if it has the Tough Boy boost. And otherwise, if you don't have Meteor Break Wizard in that row, then you're going to have a Silent Tom there, and it'll be a 21k 2 crit Silent Tom, which is also really, really strong. Another deck that we would have here would be Aura Colony. This deck focuses on having the Machining Starter in Soul, because Oracle, Think Tank, and Mega Colony, neither of them have a Forerunner that's actually good. Lozenge Magus is the only Forerunner between all of them. So having the Machining Starter in your Soul, just so that you can always have these effects go off and then not worrying about bringing them back out later with a Machining Stag Beetle. You can use Machining Hornet behind Silent Tom and have an 18k Tom in order to hit over cross rides. And then you also have 16 critical triggers. So you have a 70% chance to crit with Twin Drive, and you have pretty powerful rows all around. And then you're also running a combination of vanillas to go with your Tom. That way you still have 16k rows against decks that don't go up to 13k defense. And if they do, then you can just call the Hornet and force your opponent to crap their pants. So that's basically how that deck is going to work. Next up, we have Reindeer. So Velvet Voice Reindeer is kind of the opposite of how we judged Riviere. She actually leans really heavily into the bouncing mechanic. So her effect is when you drive check a Bermuda Triangle grade 3, bounce one of your rear guards, and then you can call one of your Bermuda Triangle from hand to an open rear guard circle. So this is basically a multi-attacker. She functions functionally identically to how Sword Magician Sarah does for Pale Moon, which we don't have yet. And this gives her a lot of versatility, especially since a lot of the units that will give you like bonus cards are grade 3s. So she has the ability to both be a multi-attacker and to let you get card advantage while multi-attacking, and that makes her honestly pretty strong. Even if you wanted to do something a little bit different with her, you could perhaps have the 10k Interceptor as a secondary call with a Sedna boost, and then just swing your first grade 3 that returns to hand Soul Blast 2 draw card into a rear guard, attack with Reindeer, check a grade 3, bounce, play the big shield, and then you get another drive check. Then you can swing 16k, and then you have that 10k Interceptor for the following turn. All in all, Reindeer is very solid. Bermuda Triangle has a lot of good support with the Perla Sisters, Perla Sisters, I don't remember the other one. Perla? I don't know. But either way, like, they have a lot of good effects that proc on call and when returned to hand, so that gives them a lot of good outs to get card advantage. So Reindeer's actually in a very solid spot. Next up, we have Machinings. Machining Stag Beetle is actually pretty strong. It gives you 2 cards from Soul when you ride it, so you actually gain card advantage from riding this card. And in addition to that, he becomes a ridiculously powerful attacker for that turn. The only downside is that the cards get called at rest, so you can't use them for that turn. But that's hardly a downside when it gets all of the power, so you could just call something behind it to use as a booster later. In addition to that, the starter allows you to stand one of the units that's called. So if you call the starter out, then you can also potentially get the power boost of, let's just say, Mantis, the 12k attacker. And then you don't lose any real power because Machining Stag Beetle is still going to be 24,000 upon the effect resolving. So that all still works out pretty great. The only downside Machining has is that it really needs Machining Armor Beetle in order to really capitalize off of its effect. The only real downside that Machining has is that you really want to get Machining Armor Beetle, which is not available yet, to be able to move that grade 0 back to Soul and be able to get more of a positive effect out of that, especially since that gives you better access to stunning as well. So this deck is kind of incomplete, but it still works pretty well for what it's trying to do. Next up, we have Tsukuyomi Rush. This is basically just running only 4 grade 3s in Tsukuyomi. I feel like this is very suboptimal. Your Riley really makes the deck super strong because on the turn that you know you're hitting your stack, you play your Riley, and then you just snipe a bunch of cards from their hand depending on how many Urileys you had saved up over the course of the game. It's pretty functionally similar to how Nubatama wants to play the Hagakure engine, but in this particular case, you're limited to a very specific situation. That being said, that specific situation is very easy to have happen, and because you're foregoing that to just have 4 grade 3s, I feel like this Rush version of the deck just isn't as strong, especially since you don't have any cards that really take advantage of the Rush. I will say that they have better overall rear guards, especially since they have a 12k attacker, but it's not quite as good as I would like. That being said, Galahad's Rush is probably just slightly stronger because he does have access to Conjurer of Mithril, which is a 7k grade 2. When you call it, check the top card of your deck. If it's a grade 1 or 2 superior, call it. Since you've skewed your deck's ratios down to only having the 4 grade 3s, that actually ends up becoming a lot easier to pull off, and that makes it more likely that you're going to be able to secure a much stronger Rush anyway. So Galahad is actually probably a little bit stronger, even though it has overall weaker rear guards. Next up, I have Phantom Blaster Overlord. So even though I did talk pretty negatively about Phantom Blaster Overlord before, and that I feel like it's superfluous and I'd rather have Bobbed Car, Phantom Blaster Overlord still isn't bad. He still has Vanguard synergy with Masquerade, even though you're probably not necessarily wanting to run any other blaster-specific cards. You could, in theory, run an Apocalypse Bat as a rear guard and have Phantom Blaster Overlord as a rear guard so you can hit 21k. But the problem with that is that you'd start soul blasting out other cards, and you would eventually have an issue where you might lose power on your Vanguard row doing that. Alternatively, you also have access to hitting pretty good rows with other cards, so I don't know why you would necessarily want to go that route, especially rear guard specifically, Phantom Blaster Overlord. especially since one of the great things about the set 4 ride chains is that you get to pitch excess grade 3s to thin your deck of grade 3s, which is something you absolutely want to do. I find that a little bit of a hard sell, but maybe there's some potential there. Overall, because the deck is almost identical to Phantom Blaster Dragon, it just has this grade 3 instead of a better grade 3. It's still pretty solid, but it's just not quite as good in my opinion. Next up, we have Basskirk. So Grand Blue is actually in an interesting spot in that it doesn't have a viable Vanguard. Basskirk is the only card that really has a good Vanguard-based effect. And even though it doesn't have a good Vanguard, its rear guards are incredibly strong. Ruin Shade attacks for 11k. Evil Shade gives you a 10k boost for effectively free. For giving you a positive secondary effect. Because putting cards in your drop zone is what you want to do anyway. Overall, like, Grand Blue is actually incredibly solid with its rear guard setup. And you can also use the Soul from Basskirk to Soul Blast out with Dancing Cutlass, which isn't even really inconvenienced because you have an 11k attacking grade 2. So you actually get the benefits of being able to play Cutlass in a way that is extraordinarily advantageous without causing the negative side effects of having a bad row. So this actually makes the deck pretty solid, even though Basskirk himself isn't doing a whole lot. Moving on, we have Kage Royals. Kage Royals is probably towards the bottom of tier 2. It's a little bit difficult to evaluate where it should be at because Kage Royals has lost access to one of the things that made it so good, and that's the ability to stop your opponent from hitting your Vanguard with a single 10k shield when their Forerunner is boosting a 7k attack. Now there just aren't enough Forerunners in this current format. When we have the full set 9 format and the promos get printed for Kagero and Royal Paladin to have the 4k top 5 grade 3 searchers and other cards like that start coming into existence, then Kage Royals will actually be stronger than what it was in this format. And that's a little bit interesting because Kage Royals is actually a little bit weaker in an earlier format and then gets stronger due to the metagame. That's just kind of funny to me. That being said, it's still very strong. You have the consistent 18k rows everywhere. If you run out of grade 2s and grade 3s to call, which is very difficult to do, then any 2 grade 1s make 16k. You're not going to be struggling to make good numbers. The only downside is how well you're going to be able to defend yourself. And since you want to guard for whenever a single card will stop an attack, then generally speaking, you're allowed to no guard a lot of the big hits later. It would have certain weaknesses. Stern Blaukluger destroys Kage Royals. And if your opponent is playing a good deck and they also guard properly, then Kage Royals doesn't really have any way to generate additional advantage over what your opponent is generating. So then it would also struggle with that outside of just sacking crits. I mean, there are 16 in there. That's possible. But that's kind of where the deck starts to edge off a little bit less than what I would like. And that's why it's down here towards the bottom of tier 2.5. And this one, I'm not sure where to put. Vanguard got top 32 or top 16 at the at the California regional tournament in 2012. But it had access to Reckless Express and Dudley Daisy and other such Spike Brothers units, and the Spike Brothers was the primary engine behind it. I tried to make a mostly vanilla engine, and I had the same issue here that I would have had with any other Rush deck, where the computer is a cheating bastard, and they keep hitting defensive triggers out the wazoo. So I don't know if the weakness of this deck was because I built it improperly, if it was because I just was getting sacked because the opponent is, again, a cheating bastard. I don't know how well this would actually do if I were to play against another person with this, and my best guess is the bottom of tier 2.5. I'm not sure where else I could go with that. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.